Is the presentation of my policy analysis on the McKinney-Vento Act and combating the educational impediments for homeless youth students. The social problem is youth homelessness. Going a little broader, initially, homelessness in the United States is very high. Over 600,000 people reported to be using shelters or living on the streets on any given night in 2016. Nearly 11% of those 600,000 are youth. So those are people that are considered to be 24 years of age and younger. So those youth, most of which are school-aged, are impacted in many facets of their life by their housing instability, especially including many obstacles to educational attainment. So it is imperative that policies are created to assist in breaking down these barriers so homeless students can have a better access and better opportunity for quality education. So before we get into assessing the educational impediments and how we solve those, we first must understand a broader definition of homelessness. So the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development defines homelessness as anyone who lacks a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. This can include literal homelessness like living on the street, temporary housing, transitional housing, couch surfing, or living in a shelter. So couch surfing is extremely prevalent amongst youth as they're living with friends from school on their couch and bouncing from house to house. Provides a very unstable living situation. But the statistics I showed on the last page and going into the definition of homelessness, that census is a point-in-time census, so it's very limited. It only considers one night during the year when it's counted, and it is limited to only on the street or in the shelter. So that can lead us to assume that the homeless population in the United States is much higher than that report may indicate. So going with that, the National Center for Homeless Education reports that there were nearly 1.2 million students experiencing homelessness during 2015, much different than that 60,000 number we saw from the point-in-time census counting. Now, homeless students face much greater barriers to academic success than their housed counterparts. Some of the effects on education are behavioral and cognitive developmental delays, transportation, difficulties getting to and from school, especially if they're living in a place much farther away from school in a transitional facility, absenteeism because of their instability, and obviously that negatively impacts their educational attainment, and also anxiety because these students don't necessarily know where they're sleeping next, and that can provide or contribute to a lot of issues behaviorally and then therefore academically. So the policy that we're going to focus on here that tries to break down those barriers and assist homeless students is the McKinney-Vento Act. So it was passed in 1987 in order to combat a wide array of problems associated with homelessness, but specifically Title VII of the McKinney-Vento Act deals with education and established the Education of Homeless Children and Youth program. So the first thing this did was establish a broader definition of homelessness. It goes and includes several things in addition to the HUD definition that we stated earlier. So that helps more students access services that are associated with the McKinney-Vento Act. Now, some of these services include the right for students to have automatic enrollment in a school without normally required records. When a student is bouncing from school to school, they might not have paperwork that is normally required, but this act says you can go ahead and start school. They also can gain free transportation access to their school of origin, so that's very important so the student doesn't have to be displaced even further than just in their housing. They wouldn't have to lose their school, and they would be able to access their school of origin. Students can receive academic support available to house students, such as night classes, if they need to catch up academically because of absenteeism associated with their homelessness. And it also created homeless liaison positions for each school district or local education agency. In some states, Massachusetts included, require a homeless liaison for every school. So these are homeless liaisons are responsible for identifying homelessness and helping intervene in homelessness and point students in the right direction so that they can be more successful academically. Now, when assessing the effectiveness of the McKinney-Vento Act, it's definitely led to a substantial increase in access to educational resources. And homeless liaisons have been a big part of that, but something that has been seen a lot is that homeless liaisons often don't know that they're even in that position. It's never their only position. It's usually an added responsibility to whatever their normal position may be. And even when they do know, they have inadequate training to properly identify and help intervene in homelessness, which leads to improper implementation of the services that can be provided to the student. Some studies show a great increase in access and student performance, some don't. So it's really hard to assess the effectiveness because there isn't that much empirical analysis. There's not a ton of research on the McKinney-Vento Act and measuring its effectiveness. And a big reason for this is the difficulty in tracking students, like the paperwork aspect that we talked about earlier. When students don't have that paperwork, it's very hard to track a student's performance from the previous school to the current school, given their instability. So some policy considerations to think about when trying to improve the McKinney-Vento Act. There's a long list of stakeholders there: students, schools, homeless liaisons, all the way to higher institutions of learning and future employers. So 3 considerations here. One is increasing the ability to track student performance, right? So we can better understand the true effectiveness of the act. Second is increasing educational trainings and seminars for schools so that school staff is better equipped to identify homelessness because it's not often self-reported with students, and also help intervene in the correct ways. And lastly, increasing funding, which we know can always be of assistance in social services, but increasing that funding from the federal government to be distributed to local and state agencies so that the right schools get more money if they have a higher ratio of homeless students. So the one recommendation that I will make is that I believe they should create a requirement in the McKinney-Vento Act that all homeless liaisons and school administrators, as well as folks from the district office or the local education agency, attend 3 training sessions per year on homelessness. These trainings would be conducted by interdisciplinary group of folks, from outreach coordinators to social workers to mental health workers to academia, people associated with universities that may study psychology or economics, anything pertaining to homelessness. So 1 training session per semester locally, with 1 large training session during the summer on a statewide level, which would provide for more resources and more connections to be made when you bring a larger group together. These trainings would help increase the knowledge of homelessness, how to identify it, how to effectively intervene. Now, this participation in training by staff would be tracked by each individual school and a school district to be reported back to the state. So these participation numbers could impact funding disbursement because schools have to apply for funds from the McKinney-Vento Act. So if a school has high participation, they may get more funding. And then taking the student tracking from when the student enters the school and begins services with McKinney-Vento Act at that school, assessing their academic progress, their absenteeism, assessing dropout rates, and comparing all of those things with the training tracking. So we can see if a school has increased training or a higher ratio of staff that is trained, does that result in more academic success for these homeless students?